All right. Well, I'm sure we'll have more people joining us, but it's gone 6:02 now here in the UK. So let's get going. Welcome everyone to this first of the Coleridge Online events of 2024. I'm Tom Duggett, and I'll be chairing this event. It's great to see everyone here. So I'm delighted to introduce as our first speaker for Coleridge Online 2024, Murray Evans. Murray is Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Winnipeg. He's retired fellow at St. John's College, University of Manitoba, Canada. He was a By Fellow at Robertson College, Cambridge. He's an associate of the Royal Conservatory of Music, Toronto. He's the author of a number of books, Rereading Middle English Romance, 1995. He's the author of Sublime Coleridge, the Opus Maximum, 2012. And he's also published essays on Malory, the Malory Manuscript, Chaucer, Piers, Plowman, Coleridge, and C.S. Lewis. His talk for us today relates to his new monograph published just last year on Coleridge's sublime later prose and recent theory. And I'll hand over to him now. Welcome, Murray.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the welcome of the Friends of Coleridge for this Zoom, and to Tom for administering it and setting it up. The time is the mid-1960s. The place, Toronto, Canada. The occasion is an early meeting of members of the collected Coleridge project. The topic of conversation is their belief that the complete publication of Coleridge's works will transform contemporary society. I heard this from a research assistant present at the meeting. Lest its opinions sound naive, the argument of social transformation certainly holds more generally for Romantic literature and culture at its inception. Medievalism and art, growing ecological awareness, social political emancipation, among other factors, indelibly transformed 19th century society in its dreams, if not always its actualities. As for Canadian society in the 1960s, the work of philosopher George Grant, poet Dennis Lee, and Romanticist theoretician Northrop Frye would inspire the institution of Canadian literature, CanLit, and Canadian studies, an immensely dispersed cultural formation since involving, to name a few, novelists Margaret Lawrence, Margaret Atwood, and perhaps arriving soon at this Zoom session, Catherine Hunter and Margaret Sweatman. Philosopher Charles Taylor, and their many readers. In the case of Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, I should add the inspiration of many viewers. There remains an important difference, though, between someone reading a novel by Alice Munro on the bus and someone else curling up in bed with a copy of Coleridge's Opus Maximum. Coleridge in our time needs his interpreters more than ever, and his cultural influence largely flows through the Academy. When it comes to Coleridgean impacts, while writing my new book, Coleridge's Sublime Later Prose and Recent Theory, I asked myself the following questions. What does Coleridge have to say to some recent cultural theorists and vice versa? To what extent do they share common ground beyond a substantial romantic pedigree? I begin by exploring Coleridge's sublime discourse and aids to reflection, hereafter AR, as it relates to his departure from symbolism in the text and his challenges in writing it. Next, I discuss Theodore Adorno's genealogy of the sublime, from Kant and the Romantics to modern art, on the fate of theology and symbolism. This involves comparisons between Adorno's aesthetic theory and Coleridge's AR and 1818 lectures on the Middle Ages. My conclusion addresses how putting Coleridge and Adorno into dialogue on my topic enhances our understanding of both. Coleridge's distinction between the beautiful and the sublime appears in a couple of fragments of the mid-18 teens and in the tabletop. When the whole and the parts are seen at once as unity and multeity, combined with pleasurableness in the sensations, there results the beautiful. Where there's neither whole nor parts, but unity, as boundless or endless allness. This is the sublime. Here, Coleridge's sublime is a complex knowledge reaching towards not the pleasurable wholeness of beauty, but the sublime, that is, something like everything, but without the articulated things. His example is a passage from Milton's Paradise Lost. According to another example of Coleridge's from nature, a mountain may be beautiful, say, in the symmetry of its multiple crags and coloring of snow and vegetation. However, the same mountain, partially shrouded in cloud, not only obscures its beautiful harmonious shape, but by virtue of its sublime obscurity, it is seemingly blended with the sky. Raimondo Modiano comments that the union of the mountain with the sky is merely guessed at, not seen. She proposes a portable definition of Coleridge's sublime, a hazy apprehension of boundless or endless allness arising from an intense engagement with the objects of sense, the poem, the mountain. For Coleridge, these qualities persist in different domains of the sublime: literature, visual art, nature, and so on. In the case of Coleridge's late major prose texts, the sense objects that I engage are the rhetorical figures of his prose. Engaging Coleridge's prose in AR is no simple venture, however. How is the sense of the sublime, of boundless allness, evident in the text? In rereading it, I came to find that the force of AR was unusual, somehow related to the changing place of symbolic theory and practice in his writing. Consider, for example, Coleridge's commitment in Statesman's Manual, 1816, to the symbolism of how the Bible imparts to readers the sublime ideas spoken out everywhere in the Old and New Testament. Here, symbols figure as the translucence of the eternal through and in the temporal. The content of such well-known passages in Statesman's Manual stipulates that the scriptures are the living edicts of the imagination, giving birth to a system of symbols, harmonious in themselves and consubstantial with the truths of which they are the conductors. Even the discourse of the passage enacts the symbolic intuitively. Coleridge elevates superior terms over inferior ones and repeatedly mimics the interanimation of symbols. The spirit of the living creature was in the wheels also, by the translucence of the special in the individual, at once portraits and ideals. Here, symbolic discourse evokes for readers the feeling of that worldview in which each symbol has a life of its own, and yet all are one life. The definition in practice does not hold for Coleridge's subsequent major prose texts. Biographia Literaria, 1817, echoes Statesman's Manual, stressing that an idea cannot be conveyed but by a symbol. But in his 1818 lectures on the Middle Ages, these lectures transmute such symbolism into more heterogeneous figures, as I will discuss below. By the early 1820s, in the Opus Maximum, Coleridge is warning readers of the dangers of analogy, a cognate term for symbol. Indeed, readers must keep the mind's eye fixed on the transcendental idea. Most symbols are, in fact, opaque obstacles excluding light. By our AR in 1825, symbol was a sign included in the idea which it represents. Finally, and on the Constitution of the Church and State, 1829, the disappearance of symbol into the idea itself is all but complete. Ideas correspond to substantial beings whose actual subsistence is implied in their idea, though only by the idea revealable, not by symbols. I want to explore then this demotion of symbolism in AR and its relationship to Coleridge's sublime discourse in the text. Coleridge sets the bar high in his advertisement to the first edition of AR. His text aims to explore the principle which pervades all Leighton's writings, his sublime view, I mean, of religion and morality as the means of reforming the human soul in the divine image or idea. Early in his letters, Coleridge tells us that his childhood reading of fairy tales habituated his mind to the vast, the sublime, without which the universe is nothing but parts, a mass of little things. How can Coleridge present Leighton's sublime view in a volume of aphorisms that could easily become a mass of little things? Folded into this problem are three challenges. Ironically, when Coleridge succeeds, he does so because he uses sublime discourse, not in spite of it. In a letter to publisher John Murray, Coleridge identifies what I take to be his first challenge in accomplishing his goal in AR. Coleridge's source, Leighton's commentary on St. Peter's epistles, varies verse by verse in subject and etc., with almost every paragraph. Faced with the accidental place of Leighton's excerpts, Coleridge must find a new principle of connection and sequence. His proposed solution is well known: to organize the aphorisms according to a transition from a not irreligious morality to a spiritual religion. He is to take his readers by graduated steps through elevating kinds of aphorisms, from the prudential through the moral and religious to that which is indeed spiritual religion. Coleridge's challenge is the difference between such a scheme and manifesting that scheme in the structure of his discourse, a situation in AR that Heather Jackson and James Bolger have also diagnosed. Douglas Headley's excellent monograph on AR makes abundantly clear that the scheme for the text is not only sound, but also draws on a long tradition stretching from Platonists in the 2nd century CE through the Cambridge Platonists. According to this tradition, Coleridge means AR to be a collection of spiritual exercises, a Christian Platonic ascent of the mind to God. This is ideational coherence that lies behind the text. But the presentation of the scheme offers only the scaffolding of ascending kinds of aphorisms, in contrast with another recurring structural feature. The first instance of this feature occurs in a long and early comment of Coleridge's for Moral and Religious Aphorisms 6. Its length underlines its importance, stretching to almost 15 pages of text and notes in the Bollingen edition. He also calls it the vestibule to all the reasoning in this volume. Here, Coleridge discusses how spirit, that which is not included in nature, appears in humanity as the will, and that both spirit and will exist. Here, he also advises novice readers to translate the theological terms of our elder divines into their moral equivalents. He coins the term religious morality for this transitional stage from which we now recommence our progress. This whole comment might lead readers to expect it to be one in a series of progressive steps to the spiritual aphorisms, the goal of AR. But similar material recurs almost verbatim 50 aphorisms later, just before the aphorisms on spiritual religion. Over 100 pages after that, and once again 50 pages later, duplicated material from the early comment reappears, well into the final set of aphorisms on spiritual religion, that is, in aphorism 17 of 24. The early vestibule of the volume appears to stretch across the whole house of AR, leaving an impression of repetition, even standing still, instead of ascending sequence in the structure of the text. No doubt, Coleridge is adapting the aphorism cum comment structure belatedly in 1823 is partly to blame, since parts of AR were already at the printers, and his revisions of the pattern of ascent for the 2nd edition of 1831 remain a truncated attempt to improve the original situation. Coleridge's second challenge in AR is gauging what kind of reader he needs to write for. His resolution of this challenge involves narrowing his intended sphere of readers, his doctrinal scope, and his method of argument. Partway through his writing of AR, as John Beer argues, Coleridge realizes that his readers are not doctrinally ready for a spiritual faith. They first need to overcome their prejudices to Christianity, to discover the common sense of basic Christian doctrines, not the more abstract doctrines above their comprehension, such as the Trinity or the origin of evil. Instead, AR will concentrate on the election of the saved and damned and vicarious atonement. These doctrines jar with readers' moral feelings of right and wrong and their sense of the goodness and justice of God. To accomplish this doctrinal adjustment, he decides to use only negative proof, arguing from what things are not positive proof, as in the incremental system building of his Opus Maximum. Coleridge's statements in AR repeatedly underlined that at the moral stage of reader's development, only negative conceptions are workable. For example, negative definition determines not what the will is, but what it is not, namely that it is not nature, since it is not representable in the forms of time and space. Since then will cannot be merely natural or below nature, he concludes it must be supernatural. Coleridge then clinches his exclusive use of negative definition. He makes statements without the least pretense to any positive notion or insight, which belongs to a more advanced stage of understanding. This negative strategy militates against his climactic arrival at the spiritual aphorisms, presumably about a positive life of faith that transcends the logic of negative definition. For Coleridge is still talking about negative definition at the beginning of his final spiritual aphorisms. As Beer indicates, a change in his plans has taken place. Coleridge scraps the spiritual aphorism. Instead, he chooses others more suitable for discussion of particular religious doctrines, notably redemption. In this way also, Coleridge's initial plan that readers might ascend from preliminary aphorisms to spiritual ones has faded in practice. His reliance on negative definition, not this, continually hints at sublimity, some barely articulable truth beyond the negatives. So if any of us have had trouble writing the thing we want to write and discover that it's turning against us into something else, and how do we manage it, then Coleridge is your person in this situation. However, he has a third challenge as well, and it's one of tone. He admires Leighton's subduedness in his coloring, a sobering silvery gray tone overall, wonderfully facilitating its soft and quiet elapse into the very recesses of our conviction. Coleridge likely aims in AR for some version of the tone in Leighton's prose, an impression of the whole that offers readers something like what Theodore Adorno and aesthetic theory calls intuitability. Meanwhile, Coleridge's association and his advertisement of AR, of sublimation and the divine idea, connects with his long note defining ideas early in his spiritual aphorisms. Here he characterizes ideas, his special use of ideas, as double, always appearing as opposites that will not coalesce. His example includes the two poles of a magnet or the two extremes of an unfolding line. Each extreme is the magnet, is the idea, but not both extremes at the same time in the same relation. Coleridge calls this double view of idea indifference. I apply the term to Coleridge's use of rhetoric in AR and Opus Maximum, a rhetoric of indifference by which readers must successively consider multiple viewpoints that never conceptually coalesce. Coleridge's use of indifference in AR becomes the crucial factor in addressing whether or not he succeeds in imitating Leighton's pervasive tone of unity and subtle conviction in AR. The length of one outstanding use of indifference in AR, 22 pages, underlines the importance of the device in the text. This crux in AR is on the doctrine of redemption. Numerous cross-references, perspective and retrospective, reinforce how important the passage is for Coleridge. These cross-references explicitly link the crux to an earlier passage in AR on the language of the Christian gospel. Here is the well-known definition contrasting analogy or symbols or analogies with metaphor in the quotation from John 3 on being born again by the Spirit. Here also, Coleridge articulates his famous distinction between the tautogorical and the allegorical. And here also, Coleridge directs readers to those purple passages in Statesman's Manual defining symbol and allegory. On the Bible as the living edicts of the imagination, a system of symbols, and so on. Given the fanfare and topical focus of this nexus of passages, readers may expect that the crux on redemption will be a reprise of Coleridge's classic definitions of symbolism, but this is not the case. To summarize briefly, the crux on redemption juxtaposes three pairs of topics, and if this is going to be an indifference, then they won't coalesce. At this point in my exposition, please take a deep breath for one of those Coleridgean moments. The first pair of topics juxtaposes the atonement of Christ on the cross with the human payment of someone else's debt. So far, so good. Then the second pair cuts against the first one. It states that while the divine redemption and the paying of a human debt may be similar in their consequences, they cannot be identical in their causes. For the cause of redemption, the redemptive act, is mysterious and transcendent. St. Paul uses four metaphors familiar to Jewish and Roman readers of his time: sin offerings, reconciliation, ransom from slavery, and payment of a debt. These are only metaphors, not analogies or symbols. They must not be taken literally for the mysterious act of redemption. Just one pair left now. After much elaborative detail, the final pair associates the confusion over redemption and its consequences with its origin. This confusion originates in discussions of the Greek fathers concerning the obscure and abysmal subject of the ground of the Godhead and the person of the Father. Coleridge does not elaborate this point. He says that it's much too abstract for his intended audience. This whole crux then comprises multiple elements that, while not strictly opposites, resist conceptual resolution as opposites do. In rhetorical terms, the crux is the whole complex of rhetorical indifferences. Readers must take it, wrestle with it as it comes. Coleridge means it to be important, but readers will find no synthesis in sight. Indifference in the passage is more than conceptually dispersive, however. It also influences tone, since the figure offers no unitive substratum of affect for readers' intuition. Indifference cannot be symbol, as Coleridge defines it in the Statesman's Manual, where symbols, the translucence of the eternal through and in the temporal, are all one life. The two discrete pieces of indifference offer no undertone of organic wholeness, the intuitive feeling tone associated with symbol, which makes higher realities present to readers through images of more sensuous immediacy, as in Coleridge's example of how natural birth symbolizes spiritual birth in John's Gospel. You must be born again. The familiar definitions of symbol in this crux are suspended in a contrary rhetoric of indifference and negative definition. Thus, Coleridge cannot provide a version of latent silvery gray underlying felt unity. In mid-process, he has decided against a symbolic representation of spiritual faith in favor of the more preparatory work of negative proof, combating readers' doctrinal prejudices. So in the crux on redemption, indifference arrays multiple assertions that, while not coalescing, stretch readers' consideration in a negative way towards the beyond of Coleridge's idea of redemption and spiritual faith. Coleridge's reliance on negative proof in AR, without an underlying felt unity of tone in the text, may explain why some readers find the text difficult, or indeed one to avoid. They may be disappointed that AR offers a different kind of imaginative engagement than Coleridge's earlier prose work. Is the text then merely flat and unappealing? Negative proof certainly cultivates for readers a tone of being resisted, put off by the continual dispersive effect of indifference, for example. But with only negative proof on offer, the mood is also strenuous. Readers must give their best shot at working with negative definition and indifference. A growing conviction in the reasonableness of doctrines previously believed to be offensive may awaken a sense of readiness for what comes next. And this sublime discourse may awaken readers' desire, since the dispersive unity of indifference beckons readers towards the sublime character of ideas by the irresolvable attraction of opposites. Finally, if readers cannot picture the life of ideas and faith, they also don't need to await the climax of an ascent to spiritual aphorisms. After all, in Coleridgean terms, the sublime appeals to their apprehension rather than their comprehension. Over the years, Coleridgeans have had good reason to single out Coleridge's definitions of symbol in Statesman's Manual as hermeneutic norms. If such statements were to remain all we knew about Coleridge and symbol, then they would constitute his global view, a version of the unity and the unity of the universal and the particular that Theodore Adorno will reject 150 years later. But recent studies by, for example, Nicholas Helmy and Nicholas Reed have complicated the place of Coleridge's early view of symbol in the canon. In light of the evidence I presented, Coleridge's later departure in practice from his earlier emphasis on symbol in Statesman's Manual anticipates Adorno's outright rejection of it in the future. Of course, what is a tendency in Coleridge has become an accomplished fact in Adorno, as I'll illustrate. But Adorno's critique illuminates retrospectively the more gradual and incomplete process in Coleridge. The same holds for Adorno's other target related to symbol, the appeal to readers' intuitability. I now turn to these two topics and their relation to Coleridge's Sublime. Theodor W. Adorno, 1903 to 69, was born in Germany under the name Theodor Ludwig Wiesengrid. His father was an assimilated Jew and his mother Catholic. Like Coleridge, Adorno was a polymath, musician, composer, an eminent musicologist, as well as University of Frankfurt professor, essayist, philosopher, and social theorist. Disseminating his work on radio and in the press, as well as in academic publications, he was an outstanding member and director of the Institute for Social Research, the Frankfurt School. He also survives a dubious honor, but he survived an interrogation by the Gestapo in 1934, and he and the Institute subsequently fled to America for the duration of the 30s and Second World War. Besides his prodigious output in music, he is perhaps best known for his Dialectic of Enlightenment, 1947, co-authored with Max Horkheimer. In this work, they expose how dehumanizing instrumental reason dominates nature and humanity in what Adorno calls the totally administered society. I've chosen aesthetic theory, 1970, because of its major focus on the sublime, a subject that has received surprisingly little sustained attention in Adorno's scholarship. My work on Adorno's aesthetic theory, hereafter AT, has concentrated on what I call his genealogy of the sublime, from Kant to modern art. My particular interest is in his constellation of the sublime, theology, art, and symbolism in the later 19th and 20th centuries. These developments illuminate what is already beginning to happen earlier in Coleridge's work. And conversely, Coleridge anticipates these later developments in Adorno. I will briefly add that two things continue to haunt me in my work on Adorno. First is the legendary difficulty of reading aesthetic theory. Sentence by sentence, his prose resists any attempt at synthesis, shades of Coleridge there. This difficulty dogs readers. Adorno recognizes the problem and confesses as he is writing that it astonishes him. Nevertheless, he writes that the task of philosophy of art is not so much to explain away the element of incomprehensibility, but rather to understand the incomprehensibility itself as the persistent character of art. I'm sorry that time doesn't permit me to offer samples of his sublime discourse here as I do in the book. Second, Adorno believes that post-war thinking must face the persistence of a culture to his day. This culture, at least, has failed to prevent Auschwitz and Hiroshima, and at most has perpetuated them. He offers a new categorical imperative that underlies the tenor and the difficulty of his work. Auschwitz must never happen again. This ethic in Adorno is relentless and deeply complicit in the difficulty of his prose. Adorno's work is generally known for his critique of the culture industry as kitsch, as well as his view of the relationship of art and society as a standoff. What he calls a semblance of art, its enchantment or magical element, is all but obliterated by the progressive disenchantment of a modern commodified society. Even so, semblance in the artwork can repudiate and disenchant the spell of a dehumanizing society. It can critique, but not overcome or reform an adverse social reality. But Adorno's scholarship needs to move beyond this standoff to issues of theology in the artwork, as recent work by Peter Uwe Hohendahl has begun to indicate. By theology, Adorno means the unqualified claim to the truth of salvation. Adorno's genealogy of the Sublime envisages that art, along with later 19th century society, loses its refuge in a fading theology. Theology as salvation resists absorption into art. For its part, art withdraws from theology, since without it, art would never become autonomous. But the fall of theology also leaves art defenseless. Without ideology, there is nothing outside artworks to protect them. Adorno condemns one final attempt at their self-protection, the self-exaltation of art as the absolute, the hubris of art as religion. This is the false hope for Adorno that the world can be redeemed through art. It would no longer embody the as if of aesthetic semblance, the spell against the totally administered society. Art religion in that case, as an absolute, would remain complicit with the dehumanized society rather than critique it. So can art survive without theology as the meaning of this existence? Yes, says Adorno. The impact of aesthetic form in the artwork now has what was once the force of traditional metaphysical meaning. In this new modern sense, he states, art remains theology. His statement is reminiscent of Coleridge's from the Biographia Literaria, where a negative faith in literature simply permits the images presented to work by their own force. What is sublime, then, about Adorno's new aesthetic theology that replaces the old defunct theology of absolute belief? The answer relates to the artwork's internal problems with itself. It remains fragile and fleeting because of what Adorno calls its truth content. Truth content is a negative theological dimension of the artwork and is not to be confused with affirmative religion. What's more, Adorno's truth content is inaccessible to rational discourse and to the artwork. Art's truth content is thus autonomous, remaining elusive and sublime. But it is not weak. Its pressure on semblance, the magic in art, can be dire, even fatal. To convey the sense of a violent truth content, Adorno repeatedly turns to Christian theological discourse. He uses the language of perishing, apocalypse, death, sacrifice, and taking upon itself all the darkness and guilt of the world. In authentic artworks, he says, truth content abolishes both semblance and artwork, leaving it behind simply as a husk. Adorno calls this process, from Romantic sublimes to his modern sublime, the movement of the sublime towards its own negation. The sublime reverses into its opposite. He also calls the sublime husk of the artwork left behind dark or black art. This movement to modern black art then dispenses with symbolism, such as Coleridge defines it in the Statesman's Manual. Gone is the view that art embodies the unity of the universal and the particular, a view, Adorno writes, imported from the theological doctrine of symbol. Adorno's truth content in modern art is a new absolute that absorbs symbols until they are no longer symbolic. His characterization of modern art as black also casts some light on his notorious statement that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. He does not mean that one must renounce artistic practice altogether. Instead, a truly critical poetry after Auschwitz must be barbaric. It must immerse itself and its readers in an aesthetic experience of that which happened, that is, of dehumanization. In order to survive reality at its most extreme and grim, artworks that do not want to sell themselves as consolation must equate themselves with that barbaric reality. Thus, in contrast with Kantian and Romantic sublimes, including Coleridge's, modern black artworks occupy the position that was once held by the concept of the sublime. What does Adorno's sublime modern art look and feel like? His use of the language of mutilation and disfigurement provides one answer to this question. This language is present in the final aphorism of his post-war book of aphorisms, Minima Moralia, Reflections from Damaged Life. Here Adorno evokes the attempt, quote, to contemplate all things the way that they would present themselves from the standpoint of redemption. In the Messianic light, he writes, the world reveals its tears and cracks, as it at some point will lie there, needy and disfigured. The pertinence of disfigurement for a literary text, including Adorno's own prose and aesthetic theory, appears in another comment by Adorno on Franz Kafka. Kafka presents the image of the society to come as a montage made up of waste products. The emerging order extracts this garbage from the perishing moment. In a related vein, Adorno regards the prototype characters of Samuel Beckett's Endgame as also historical. What they present as typical of human beings are just deformations, the deformations inflicted upon them by the form of their society. This disfigured state extends to the humor in the play. Even the jokes of those who have been damaged are damaged. They no longer reach anyone. The pun, the degenerate form of which there is a bit in every joke, covers them like a rash. The bad habits and tics of the normal personality, which Endgame intensifies unimaginably, are the universal form, the physiognomy of what is no longer human. Adorno's condemnation of previous transcendental symbolic art also affects what his modern art feels like. In condemning symbolic art, he also rejects the associated intuitability that such art encourages in its beholders, the offer of intimacy, of immediate, non-conceptual contact with the artwork. Such intuitability seeks to maintain a roundedness of artworks. It then attributes this quality to the reality corresponding to the artwork. Instead, Adorno turns to the non-sensuous, desolate, starkly conspicuous language of modern art that denies access by readers' intuition. Adorno's strategy sheds light on the intuitability that, as I've argued earlier, Coleridge aims for in aids to reflection, but largely must abandon. Previous signs of this trend in Coleridge appear in his 1818 lectures on the Middle Ages, containing the oft-quoted scene in a Gothic cathedral. The lectures illustrate how Coleridge's consideration of symbolism in the symbol occurs at the expense of symbol, if not yet in the total reversal of the sublime into its opposite in Adorno's modern black art. In these lectures, Coleridge evokes a wide canvas of a cathedral, of York, of Milan, or of Strasbourg. He depicts its many chapels, its pillared stem and leafwork roof, as if some sacred grove of Hertha, the mysterious deity of their pagan ancestors, had been awed into stone at the approach of the true divinity. He calls the result a pagan past, thus dignified by permanence into a symbol of the everlasting gospel. But Coleridge's continuing description slips away from symbol as defined in Statesman's Manual, the translucence of the eternal through and in the temporal. Instead of symbol, he next calls the scene an assemblage collected before your imagination. The terms assemblage and collective emphasize the heterogeneity of the scene. Here, multiple qualities of Greek and Roman culture are joined with multiple qualities of the Goths, their deep feelings, high imagination, chivalrous courtesies, and strong breathings after immortality. The force of symbol, then assemblage in the details of the cathedral scene, is centrifugal, pushing out towards a boundless or endless allness without clear parts or holes, marks of Coleridge's Sublime. In fact, the sublimity of the Gothic cathedral is central to his lectures. Greek art is beautiful, and Gothic art is sublime. According to William Hammond's notes on the lecture, when I enter a Greek church, I feel exalted and proud that I am a man. But he continues, the Gothic art is sublime. On entering a cathedral, I am filled with devotion and with awe. I am lost to the actualities that surround me, and my whole being expands into the infinite. Earth and air, nature and art, all swell up into eternity, and the only sensible impression left is that I am nothing. Greek architecture fails where the Gothic poetry of the Middle Ages succeeds in affecting feelings, because the Goths, unlike the Greeks, prefer the sublime. They cannot be satisfied by any statue, since their minds have a tendency to the infinite, satisfied with what is indistinct. J.H. Green's notes on the lecture repeat the theme of the profound impact on the beholder of the Gothic sublime. In the scene where Coleridge stretches and begins to deform his use of symbol, the beholder in the Gothic cathedral experiences a sense of self-annihilation and thus becomes a part of the work contemplated. The beholder joins in with the symbolic and sublime unraveling. Both Coleridge and Adorno ponder such subjective responses. Is the change only in the subject's self-perception before the artwork, or does the encounter signal actual change in her? In Adorno's case, the participant's response to the artwork navigates the sublime dilemma of truth content in art. How it cannot be explained in positive terms yet will remain mute without philosophy. Adorno's answer is that access to truth content comes by what he calls shudder. This is a shock elicited by the artwork, the moment in which recipients forget themselves and disappear into the work. In a way reminiscent of the vertiginous encounter with the Gothic cathedral in Coleridge, Adorno recipients lose their footing. But for Adorno, shudder can also reveal and dissolve the subject's petrification in her own subjectivity. The subject becomes conscious of its own nullity and attains beyond it to what is other. Here, Adorno's description of its own nullity chimes with a sense of nothingness in Coleridge's beholder of the sublime Gothic cathedral. But as I pursue elsewhere in my book, the nullity of Coleridge's beholder will correlate in his On the Constitution of the Church and State with those parapolitical members of his clerisy. Together in their various professions and conflicting views, they will possess and discern the ideas of the good and of the Constitution on behalf of society. Their work is to counterbalance the expediency and commercial preoccupation of the formal state. For Adorno, the shock of shudder can release beholders of art, on the other hand, to critique a whole society and politics possessed by commodification and instrumental abstraction. His battle is not for Coleridge's supersensual ideas, but for the social political recovery of a lost form of participation in which the subject transcends itself toward things in order to release them and their otherness to subjectivity. In conclusion, I've argued that the irresolvable doubleness of Coleridge's big I ideas and his decision to approach his material by for aids to reflection. His plan for ascending aphorisms to the spiritual falters, and his exclusive use of negative proof and basic doctrines deflects his inquiring readers from arriving at spiritual knowledge. Finally, any hope for a tone of unified wholeness is at cross purposes with his reliance on negative definition. It's not this, and indifference. The double exposure of successive, conflicting, multiple viewpoints that will not coalesce, as in the Long Crooks and Redemption. The outcome is a reliance on sublime rather than symbolic discourse. But his sublime negative in force also encourages less prejudiced understanding of Christian doctrine and a sense of the life of faith beyond the conceptual, a transition that may happen at any moment of reading. Adorno's genealogy of the sublime from Kant and the Romantics to modern Black art obviously intervenes at a different historical moment than Coleridge's, and the objects of their respective sublimes are also different. For Adorno's story maps an antithetical sublime onto the demise of theology. It transposes the old theology into aesthetic form in art. And art's sublime truth content violently dismantles traditional symbolism. But there is also surprising common ground in Coleridge and in Adorno for a reader's experience of art. The assumption that encounters with the sublime can lead to altered subjectivity. This commonality occurs in what Adorno calls the nullity associated with the shudder and before the artwork, and in Coleridge's sense of nothingness and annihilation before the Gothic cathedral. The historical discontinuity between Coleridge and Adorno then is dialectical, whereby things turn into opposite things without entirely shedding the originals. This is the attack of Kantian and Romantic sublimes as they become Adorno's sublime of modern Black art. Adorno's term for this continuity and great difference is sublimation, whereby, as Martin J. underlines, no sublimation succeeds it does not guard in itself what it sublimates. Adorno would not believe, as Romanticist Thomas Weiskell does, that the more transcendent theological version of Coleridge's Romantic Sublime is now pretty much dead. For Adorno, Coleridge's distinctive combination of the sublime with Christian theology would not disappear in the blackness of Adorno's modern art, since past historical versions of the sublime are both altered and also retained, sedimented in the present moment of modern art, however much they are more disfigured there. And Coleridge's departure in AR from the symbolism of the Statesman's Manual anticipates Adorno's more severe rejection of symbolism 150 years later. Adorno's sublimation of Romantic sublimes can thus appear as one of numerous future possibilities that Coleridge's sublime and theology could become in our time, after the Holocaust, without being utterly superseded. These insights not only bring Coleridge closer to Adorno's modernity in ways that do not immediately meet the eye, but also take Adorno back to Coleridge's past.
Thank you very much, Murray. That was a fantastic talk. I was trying to make a summary as you were going, and towards the end, it reached such another level that I realized my summary was going to be hopeless. So I'll just say quickly that so you took us through the challenges that Coleridge sets himself in Aids to Reflection. I think you outlined 3 challenges: a kind of scale of communication or directness, and then of tone. And then you talked about a sublime shift, perhaps away from symbol to ideas or other rhetorical forms. And then you moved towards talking about Adorno. And where my summary completely became inadequate was when you did that transformative and really suggestive reading of the Gothic cathedral passage, sort of doing that by way of Adorno and completely changing or suggesting whole new ways of thinking about what Coleridge is doing in church and state and with his account of the clerisy. So thanks so much for that, Murray. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Can I ask if people would just like to ask a question? Can you just use the raise hand function, and then I'll come to you for your question. So questions for Murray. I can see Diana has her hand up. Diana, do you want to unmute yourself? I think you're still muted, Diana. Maybe you carry on. Oh, great. Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes, you're unmuted now.
Yes, thank you. Astonishing. I also had the great problem of trying to take notes on that and thinking, right, if I could just say, could you read that once again, please? I shall fix better. Two questions, which may be connected. First of all, I understand now why I've never been able to read Aids to Reflection, despite my disappointment. And yet lots of young men, lots of eager people could in the 19th century. So part of my question is to say, how did they do it? Without the benefit of your elaborate account of the structure and negatives and so on. But also the modern part of your talk. I'm more interested in contemporary poetry than modern art, but I'm very struck by the fact that the best exemplar, perhaps, of this sublime in modern art is Paul Celan, obviously.
Yeah.
And Sylvia Plath would be another one. And they're both suicide poets. So I'm wanting to ask you about the link between a kind of cult of suicide, or assisted dying, as we might call it, and the modern sublime. I'm sorry, those questions are one miles apart in a way, and yet they bookend my response to your wonderful talk.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'd be glad to speak to them The first one having to do with how his 19th century readers managed. And these readers were, as you know, Emerson, Carlyle, John Stuart Mill, stretching, through the 19th century, through various, the Broad Church movement in the Church of England, through the 20th century to Raymond Williams. So what is it? Let's put it this way. Coleridge, suicidal in the early 18 teens, picks up Leighton's commentary and reads it, these excerpts, and felt this elapse into his soul of the comfort that Archbishop Leighton was communicating through the excerpts. His daughter, when she feels suicidal, sometime later, reads Aids to Reflection and is comforted. He thought that he could write and give people a sense of the spiritual faith that had sustained him through those troubles of his. What he discovered in the people that he was reaching out to, and he conducted, as you know, classes in talking about these things, young men, he discovered that they weren't ready. They were annoyed at God killing his own son on the cross, and they were befuddled by literalist interpretations of the crucifixion, which spent time weighing, how much suffering would Jesus have to do in order for the world's suffering to be met. And so he's dealing with these intelligent, skeptical questions. And he, as you realize, he revamped. He wrote in this negative mode. That's what those readers of the 19th century needed. And some of them fell out of their enthusiasm with Aids to Reflection. And some of them never went on to a real life of faith, which becomes innate and transformative. And some of them did. It enabled broad churchmen, church people of the later 19th century to deal with Darwin, for example. So what they got was not what Coleridge had and wanted to pass on through the looking glass.
Yeah.
What they got was something else, which was, and Jacques Rancière talks about this line of influence, mentions Coleridge explicitly. What they got was this kind of persistence towards faith as their questions became answered about some of the silly explanations that the church typically gave when it was presenting doctrines. So fast forward, if I may, to your second question, not so fast forward. By modern art, Adorno means visual art for sure, but much of aesthetic theory is referring to music and Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, some of the moderns that he was preoccupied with. So poetry would qualify, and he quotes German authors under this rubric of modern art. I think that Adorno thought he would look at the art of Paul Celan, who was a survivor from Nazi concentration camps. He would look at that art and he would see an embodiment, as you said, of the blackness of the end point
Yep.
of modern fascism. And I think this is one reason why Adorno, although he died in 1970, before he could see the things that are going around us societally and in politics, was he wrote a book on the authoritarian personality and on the Nazis. So the pertinence of suicide to this kind of modern art was, I think, for Adorno, an honest encounter with the blackness of Hiroshima and Auschwitz. And for a Jew like Adorno and like Xi'an, the inevitability of the scapegoating that happened of the Jews under the Nazis would justify for many suicide, because one was immersed in it. And the only cure is to write art, write poetry that immerses you in it and engages your readers in abandoning false hopes about human perfectibility.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for such a detailed response.
Well, it was a great, and it's an important question. I mean, there is a draw in writing about these things. And I hope I communicated some of it in my presentation. But your question does go to the heart of much of what Coleridge, on the one hand, and Adorno were doing.
Yeah, thank you.
I was thinking of you, Tom, when I was talking about the scene in the cathedral, because one of the people I read who inspired me towards the aesthetic end of what you were working on in other cultural manifestations was your own work on Wordsworth and Coleridge, amongst others. So I'm glad that chiming happened on the topic.
Well, yeah, thank you. Thanks for saying that, Murray. I mean, yeah, my account of that was, well, yeah, I guess it was about Coleridge and Coleridge thinking about Wordsworth in a way. I think you put it into a much bigger frame for us. But any other questions for Murray?
I know there are poets and creative writers here, old friends of mine, some of them from Winnipeg. And of course, this bears on issues of theology. So there's at least one poet and theologian here from the UK who ponders these things and has presented on them and on Coleridge's poetry. No pressure.
Well, I mean, while we're waiting for your your pressure to have effect, Murray, can I ask you maybe I'm sure in some way you definitely said this, but maybe I didn't fully notice well or sort of follow it. It's clear for Adorno in your argument what's driving this move away from the symbol. So, but you talked about for Coleridge that it's a tendency that in Adorno is achieved in some way. So, what is it for Coleridge that's driving this? I mean, is it, you talked about him not reprising things from the Statesman's Manual. You talked about, I think you used a phrase about he must abandon intuitability, the intuitability of symbol. So my question, I guess, was about like in what sense what's driving him away? For Adorno, in a way, it's kind of clear what the pressure is. Auschwitz, assuming you very kind of, profoundly said. But so what is it for Coleridge? What's driving him away from symbol?
Part of it is the impetus of its poetry. And those of us who work on Coleridge's later prose, I think, might envy Morton Paley, who wrote a book called Coleridge's Later Poetry, which is an amazing book. And one of the things he points out, well, two. First, Coleridge's later poetry starts early. It starts probably around 1807. So we know Rime of the Ancient Mariner, we know Kubla Khan, we know Kristeva. But then this other stuff comes along. And it's not these poems. And so I suppose early on there were people who, well, Coleridge himself dramatizes the situation by saying he's read too much metaphysics. So, he's lost his poetic gift. But in fact, his poetic gift shifts, for one thing, into poetry, according to Paley, from symbol to allegory. So he has his poetic muse, so to speak, has taken him out of a reliance and symbol to other figures. And the poetry is, I'm sure some people here know more about this than I do. The poetry is amazing, the later poetry. But it's not that earlier symbolic sensorium of Kubla Khan. So one thing is the pressure of his poetic art. Rather, he didn't really lose it. It became diverted. The second thing I think is an awareness ahead of time. I mean, he was reading these German philosophers in German, had attended their lectures on a visit to Germany early in the 19th century. And he realizes that the Christian faith, which led him through his addiction, his opium addiction, was going to run into the juggernaut of the German higher criticism of the scriptures and a loss of faith that we know happened amongst the Victorians. And I think he was exercised to find ways of writing that could forestall that. And much of that writing wasn't published. So readers heading for Darwin could not take advantage of it. But I think he writes in Aids to Reflection, look, if you don't want to use the language of sanctification by the Holy Spirit, then you can use a language of transformation into a higher morality. And if you're reading these ancient texts on religion, then dress them down in their language if it can communicate something cognate or more than cognate. So I think for those two reasons, the pressure of changes in religious culture and thinking, and also the pressure of his own poetic art.
Thank you, Murray. Catherine has her hand up. Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Murray. So that was amazing. It's way, have I ever said this to you before? It's over my head. But I do have a question that I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about this concept of incomprehensibility, because I was really intrigued at one sort of, I guess, rhetorical turn that you took. You said that Adorno, like Coleridge, in his writing, right? Adorno's writing like Coleridge's writing. I think you said it resists cohesion, or it resists something.
Sure.
And I think the idea of it resists cohesion. And then you said that I think you're talking about Adorno. that he was not sort of trying to explain away incomprehensibility, but rather was trying to understand incomprehensibility. Am I hearing that
Yeah, yeah,
right?
no,
Yeah. So
you're hearing it. So,
could
sorry.
could you just maybe expand on that a little bit? Because I'm very fascinated by that idea.
Yeah, I think of an analog to this, and I was rereading bits of Frank Kermode's book on the Gospel of Mark. Jesus says in the New Testament that he tells parables in order that people won't understand and won't get healed. It's a notorious crux in New Testament studies. But I think that Adorno, who had little time for the church, for good reason, it had disappeared virtually under the Nazis, unless it were a Nazification of the church, is chiming, as it were, with the motive for telling parables. That people will perhaps come to understand something in a different way than rather than understand it in the wrong way, and to be told something that they can't understand. It has to be creative misunderstanding rather than ignorant misunderstanding. And Adorno wrote, as he says, in a way that astonished him, an aesthetic theory, which was to be his great work. He wrote in a way that was so non-understandable up to a point that it conveyed the sense of modern art that he felt was the cure for the kinds of rabbit hole thinking that government regimes and societal norms had got us into. So when he talks about the shudder of modern art, I'm trying to, well, Beckett, a friend of his, Beckett is a good example of this. A story, I think it was in Sing Sing, where inmates watched Waiting for Godot. And at the end of the performance, they said, finally, someone has conveyed life as we experience it here.
Right.
So, yes, Adorno wants people not to understand because their socialization into abstract thinking has cut them off not only from nature, but from things. Things have been so packaged, so commodified. And can't we understand that in some of our moments of clear thinking? Things have been so commodified that you must be jarred by things you misunderstand.
So that's how that leads into, so that's a lot more radical than I thought it was. So that's how then you led into the famous, we can't have poetry after Auschwitz. And then, so him saying that poetry must be barbaric. Is that partly what is leading from that? It must be inexplicable, incomprehensible, sharp edges and jagged and Beckettish. That's okay. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and his modern art is that music, those playwrights, those poets, and now, if you agree, and I did mention you, Catherine, actually as a current practicing Canadian poet and novelist in the lead up, that that premise about writing hermetic poetry may still in some generic form hold for today.
Yes.
I don't, I'm thinking of poems of yours that I know. And there is some of that. It doesn't need to be more, but there is some of that in the places that you come from and in the poems that you write.
Yeah, I don't like to tie things up in a pretty little bow, but I do like to be, I do try to be comprehensible in some sense. And people will always take away something, right, from a painting, or what one person will say, that makes no sense, right? There's nothing there. And other people will take away like 6, 7, 8 different people will take away 6, 7, 8 different things from it. But I also, this is kind of obvious, but I'll state it anyway. Hitler hated that modern art, right?
Yeah.
That disfigurement, yeah.
Yeah. And one can only imagine the kind of art. Well, one doesn't have to imagine, one can go back to Stalin and Hitler, but one can imagine with some current politicians the kind of art that they would tolerate should they maintain power or get into power. And I'm sure, well, it's happening with Ukrainian writers now under the influence of the Russian invasion.
Wow, I love the way you're tying all those things together. It's amazing. Yeah.
Right. Any last questions? I think we're actually approaching the end of our time, but I don't want to cut the event off if anyone. Okay, Willow has a question.
Hi, Willow.
Hi. I just want to thank you very much for this amazing presentation and the depth and richness of all the ideas that you've brought forward about Coleridge and Adorno. I'm not a Coleridge scholar, but I do have an old and very fond familiarity with the Sublime. And my recent work is about ecological crisis. And as we know, you know, at its inception, the Sublime was very largely understood through experiences of nature. We talk about mountains and rivers and all the beautiful things, right? Which are, alas, disappearing or being conflicted. And I am wondering now how we access the Sublime at all.
Yeah, and I take it particularly in nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, I must say that I have trouble looking at a sunset these days, realizing that some of the beauty of it, so to speak, is generated by our bad habits culturally. There is a whole, a very large theme in aesthetic theory about reconciliation with nature. And in the his earlier book with Horkheimer, Adorno talks about how, and in aesthetic theory, he talks about how nature has been hurt by the ascendancy of instrumental reason and the cyclical versions of that. Nature has been hurt, and that pain is part of what, and that pain of human alienation is part of what makes for dissonance in modern art. So that's, I've spent a few pages on that in the book because my interests are more aesthetic. I haven't dwelt on it, but it comes up. I'm trying to think in connection with this his essay on Xi'an, Paul Xi'an, it comes up as the sort of language with the outrages, human outrages upon nature, the sort of language that poetry must speak in. And that language is inorganic. Speaking of, getting away from organic symbols, that the reality is conveyed through the presentation of the symbol. That it's inorganic, it's mute, it's dissonant, and it's the language that the dead speak. The dead of Auschwitz speak this language. And this is wrapped up with the brutalization of nature. I will add, and it speaks to a couple of the questions briefly, I will add that if you want Adorno in a clear version on art, his late 1950s lectures on aesthetics have been published. And it's, he jokes, he's clear, he's collected student responses from the last lecture, and he starts the next lecture answering students' questions. And this is the book on aesthetics that readers of Adorno lust for after reading aesthetic theory.
Right.
But in the 1960s, his students who were demonstrating against Vietnam and so on, eventually wanted him to support their efforts, wanted him to be a kind of poster boy. And they invaded his lectures and humiliated him because he felt that you had to be critical before you engaged in praxis, or else you just become violent.
Right. Well, thank you for that. Thank you.
I think we are now at more or less at the end of our time. So thanks everyone for your questions. Thanks, Murray, for fantastic and generous answers to all the questions and for your fantastic talk. Just remains for me to say we'll be having another one of these events, hopefully at the end of April. So keep your eyes peeled for that. It'll be announced through BARS and NASA and so on, and the Friends of Coleridge. There's a recording made of today's talk, so anyone who wants to revisit it can go back and rewatch and try to recomprehend whatever may have still been incomprehensible or not, as the case may be.
Will that be on the Friends of Coleridge website?
Well, yeah, hopefully. Maybe the new website, which is going to be launching at some point in the not too distant future, we hope, and possibly through a new YouTube channel. But anyway, I'll let people know how they can access it. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks so much, and let everyone go back to their rest of their Saturday. Thank you. Bye bye.
Right. Thanks everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Murray. I'll be in touch.
Bye.